High Park Street Intermediate School. My name is Celia Perez, and I am the author of The First Rule of Punk. And today I'm going to read for you chapter 22 from the book. And I picked this chapter because it's one of my favorites, and it was one of my favorite scenes to write. So this is the chapter where Malu has dinner with her neighbor, Senora Oralia. Or rather, Malu and her mom have dinner with Senora Oralia and Senora Oralia's family, and the family includes Joe, who is Malu's new classmate, and his mom, Mrs. Hidalgo, who runs the Calaca coffee shop. And I really like this chapter because it's the first one where you see all of these generations together, and it's where Malu starts to see how being Mexican American is very different depending on your experiences and your background, and it's also where the light bulb goes off for the alternative talent show. So this is chapter 22. Senora Oralia's door was open a crack, and the smell of something delicious filled the hallway. Mom knocked, and we waited as footsteps shuffled toward the door. Venga, muchachas, she said, grabbing us each by an arm. We've been waiting for you. She pulled us inside with a grip that was pretty strong for an old lady's. I made chilaquiles, she said. I think you're going to like them. I love chilaquiles, Mom said. Senora Oralia had invited us to Sunday dinner with her family. Joe, Mrs. Hidalgo, and Mr. Hidalgo, who looked like an older Joe with a mustache, were in the kitchen when we arrived. We greeted everyone, and Mom placed the bowl of bean and corn salad she'd made on the counter, which was already covered with enough food to feed more than 6 people. You want a pop? Joe asked, holding out 2 bottles of bright red jarritos. Pop? I asked, taking one. Don't you mean soda? Maybe where you're from, dude. I took a swig of the soda that tasted like fizzy strawberry candy. I hope the chilaquiles aren't too picosos, Senora Oralia said as we sat down to eat. I like them spicy. Mama, you know you're not supposed to eat spicy food, Mrs. Hidalgo said. Ay, look at this one talking to me like she's the mother, Senora Oralia said and laughed. What's a little spice now and then, right? That's right, Boily, Joe said, dishing up a spatula full of chilaquiles onto his plate. Don't encourage her, Joe, Mrs. Hidalgo warned. What about you, Malu? Do you like spicy food? I felt like I was in the hot seat, no pun intended. But before I could answer, Mom jumped in. I'm afraid Malu didn't inherit the Mexican taste buds. Everyone laughed except for me. Don't worry, Mr. Hidalgo said, rubbing his stomach. You aren't the only one who can't handle spicy food. I rolled my eyes at Mom and shoved a forkful of chilaquiles into my mouth to prove her wrong, immediately regretting it. I could feel my tongue slowly begin to throb as the heat of the peppers crawled over it like an army of tiny fire ants. Toma leche, Senora Oralia said, noticing my discomfort. Milk helps with the spiciness. Too hot for you, huh, Maria Luisa? Joe laughed. He didn't seem to have a problem with it. He had already devoured 1 serving and was going in for seconds. I stuck with Mom's salad, which was not spicy and was cilantro-free, and the plain enchiladas Mrs. Hidalgo brought. After dinner, Mr. Hidalgo made coffee, and Senora Oralia brought out a yummy-looking cake. I'm so full, Mom said, as Mrs. Hidalgo set out plates. I don't know if I can eat another bite. You have to try at least a small slice, Mrs. Hidalgo said. I need guinea pigs for this cake. It's a vegan 3 leches. Vegan? ¿Y qué es eso? Senora Oralia asked Mrs. Hidalgo. It's an oxymoron, Mr. Hidalgo said and laughed. Vegan, Mrs. Hidalgo repeated. That means it has no milk, no dairy. Oh boy, Joe whispered to me. Here we go. Un postre de 3 leches sin leche, Mrs. Hidalgo finally asked. She shook her head and laughed. No, she guffawed. I remembered that word from a vocabulary list last year. Senora Oralia's laugh was loud and boisterous from deep in her belly, like it had been stored there, waiting for this specific moment. It was definitely a guffaw. I had to admit, a vegan 3 leches cake did sound a little bizarre, since I knew that 3 leches meant 3 milks, and vegan means no dairy or animal products of any kind. That sounds interesting, Mom said, but why vegan? Believe it or not, we have a lot of people who come into the coffee shop who are looking for vegan alternatives, especially for baked goods, Mrs. Hidalgo said. Even Mexicans, Mama. She gave Senora Oralia a surprised look that was clearly exaggerated. Not these Mexicans, right, Boily? Joe asked, putting his arm around Senora Oralia. We like our milk and eggs and butter. Ana always has to be different, Senora Oralia said. Look different, eat different, think different. I glanced at Mrs. Hidalgo, who was slicing the cake. She had a look on her face that I knew well, a look that said she'd heard this a million times. Tell me about it, Mom said, pointing her thumb in my direction. This one is allergic to anything that she thinks is too normal, just like her dad. Geez, I said, we're right here. I looked at Mrs. Hidalgo and she smiled and winked. It felt good to have someone who could be part of my we, especially someone like Mrs. Hidalgo. Willie, tell them the story about when Mom came home with her first tattoo, Joe said. Ah, see, Senora Oralia said, waving her hands. It's a miracle I didn't have a heart attack. You're so dramatic, Mrs. Hidalgo said, shaking her head. Mom said Willie fainted and bumped her head and they had to take her to the hospital, Joe said. Really? I asked. I couldn't believe Senora Oralia I couldn't believe it. Senora Oralia didn't seem like the kind of lady who would freak out over tattoos, or over anything, really. I still remembered the purple nail polish she'd worn when I first met her. Pobrecita, Mrs. Hidalgo said. She reached over to pat Senora Oralia's shoulder. She wouldn't talk to me for weeks. Remember, Mama? For an entire month, she'd leave me these little notes. It was ridiculous. My head hurt for days, Senora Oralia said, and only part of it was because of the fall. She looked at Mrs. Hidalgo with a twinkle in her eye. Ana was always up to something. Tell them about when I had to pick you up at the police station. This sounds like an interesting story, Mom said. My mom, the lawbreaker, Joe said and laughed. It was no big deal, Mrs. Hidalgo said as she distributed slices of cake. What happened? I asked. I couldn't imagine Mrs. Hidalgo getting into trouble. What could she have possibly done? My high school had a pretty strict dress code for the homecoming dance. We couldn't wear sneakers, and our outfits had to be at least semi-formal, so the boys had to wear jackets and ties, Mrs. Hidalgo said. A group of us thought it was unfair. Unfair how? Mom asked, slicing a bite of cake with her fork. Well, it discriminated against kids who couldn't afford to buy ties or jackets if they didn't already have them, Mrs. Hidalgo said. Plus, some of us wanted to wear sneakers with our dresses. Estos muchachos had their own dance where they weren't supposed to be, Senora Oralia said, giving Mrs. Hidalgo a stern look, like she'd just gotten the call from the police right at that moment and not years ago. Well, he's still mad, Joe said. We asked the administration to reconsider the dress code and to be a little more lenient, Mrs. Hidalgo went on, ignoring Senora Oralia and Joe, but they wouldn't, so we organized an anti-homecoming dance and protest. That's so rad, I said, glancing at Mom. You could come dressed as you pleased. Fancy formal wear not required, Mrs. Hidalgo said with a nod. And instead of an entrance fee, we asked for a donation, either money or food for a local homeless shelter. So where do the police come into the story? Mom asked. I could tell she wanted me to know that calls from the police were not okay. Mrs. Hidalgo explained that they needed a space for their dance. They decided to use an empty garage that was owned by one kid's uncle. The only problem was that they never asked for permission. So when neighbors heard music and saw kids going in and out, they called the police. And you got caught? I asked. We were trespassing on private properties, so the police came. They called our parents and cut our dance short, Mrs. Hidalgo said. Were you arrested? I asked. No, contrary to what my mom said, we weren't taken to the police station. She shot Senora Oralia a stern look. Same thing, Senora Oralia said with a shrug. The police called me to come get my delinquent daughter. We should have asked to use the garage, but kids make mistakes, Mrs. Hidalgo said. I can imagine how worried you were when you got a call from the police, Mom said to Senora Oralia, ignoring the fact that Mrs. Hidalgo had done the coolest thing ever. Pues sí, she said. I think she's in one place and she's somewhere else making trouble. Not making trouble, Mrs. Hidalgo said. I'm still glad that we stood up for what we believed was right. Psh, she hasn't changed one bit, Senora Oralia said, but she didn't sound angry. It was more like she found the stories funny now. How can she be mad? Mrs. Hidalgo asked, taking a bite of her cake. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right, Mama? How did you ever get through it? Mom asked, glancing at me, having a contrarian daughter. We did not always agree with each other, Senora Oralia said, but I always told her to stand up for what she believes in. What comes from here? Senora Oralia put a fist to her heart. Even if it means getting arrested? Joe asked. Everyone laughed. It sounds like you have a pretty good relationship now, Mom said, looking from Senora Oralia to Mrs. Hidalgo. She still thinks I'm cuckoo, Mrs. Hidalgo said, but she tries to understand who I am, and that we're all different in our own ways, right, Mama? Senora Oralia reached over and stroked Mrs. Hidalgo's pink streak of hair. You're right, Ana, Mom said, surprising me. I hadn't really thought about it, but I guess I was a contrarian too. You? I asked. Yes, me, Mom said. I left home to go to college. That was something no one in my family had ever done, but I felt like I needed to see more, find my place, you know? And how did that go over with your family? Mrs. Hidalgo asked. Mom laughed. Well, my parents were always supportive, but I think they would have preferred to be supportive from a closer distance, Mom said. It was hard to leave them. I think it was just scary for everyone, something different and unfamiliar, and it's still hard all these years later to be so far away from each other, but it's gotten easier? Mr. Hidalgo asked. In some ways, Mom nodded. Easier, but not easy. Mom looked at me and smiled, and for a moment I thought maybe she actually understood. You American teenagers, Senor Oralia said, too much free time. In my day, you would have been too busy working. No time for dancing or funny hair colors. And we'd be walking 12 miles to school in the desert too, right? Joe's dad asked. School? ¿Qué school? You would be working, mijo. We all laughed again. This has been so much fun, Mom said, and nudged me. Gracias por todo, señora. Thank you, I said. Muchas gracias. The Spanish words felt like they were stuck in my teeth. Whenever that happens, I get more self-conscious. You don't like to speak Spanish, Senor Oralia said. It was not so much a question as a declarative statement. I shrugged, once again in the spotlight. She just doesn't speak it often, so she's not used to it, Mom said. It's good to have two languages, Senor Oralia said. You know how I learned English? Listening to the Beatles. Really? Mom asked. Si, señora. I could not speak a word of English, but I worked for a family who had a teenager. We would listen to records together. I was singing Twist and Shout and didn't even know what any of it meant. Senora Oralia let out another hearty guffaw and shook her head as if she couldn't believe what she was telling us. I used to be able to do the twist too, Mira, she said as she started to move in her chair. I tried to imagine a young Senora Oralia dancing to the Beatles, but I could only picture her the way she looked now, doing the twist in the unicorn house dress she'd worn the first day we met her, fuzzy slippers on her feet. I smiled thinking about it. Don't lose your language, Senora Oralia said, like words were something that might end up under the bed with mismatched socks and dust bunnies. After dessert, I sat on Senora Oralia's flowery couch while Joe flipped through channels on the oldest television set I'd ever seen. It looked like a piece of furniture, the screen encased in wood and surrounded by little fake drawers. I kept thinking about Mrs. Hidalgo and her anti-homecoming dance idea. How did she ever come up with such a great way to make a point? And wasn't she afraid of getting in trouble? She must have really believed in what she was doing to take that risk. At that moment, she seemed like the bravest person I knew. And then, like the scarecrow who suddenly got a brain, a light bulb went on. I jumped up from the couch, which must have startled Joe because he'd dropped the rabbit ear antenna he was fiddling with. Band meeting at Calaca tomorrow afternoon, I said. I'll tell Ellie, you let Benny know. But we didn't make the list, he said. It doesn't matter, I said with a smile. The Cocos are just getting started. So that's the end of the chapter. And sometimes people ask me if any of my characters or any of the story is based on true events. And I always like to mention that, so my mom came to the U.S. from Mexico when she was in her teens, and she came to work, and she worked for a family who had teenage children. And so she was like live-in help for this family, and she didn't speak English, and a lot of the English that she learned from listening to the Beatles and other rock bands of the time in the 1960s. And so that little piece of Senora Oralia's story comes from my mom's own experiences when she came to this country. So thank you for listening. Have fun with your March Madness, and enjoy reading. Thank you.